LETTER the 52nd of Life in Mexico. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Life in Mexico by Francis Calderon de la Barca. LETTER the 52nd. Last day in Mexico. Theatre. Santa Anna. French Ministers. Parting. Diligence. Last look of Mexico. Fatigue. Robbers. Escort. Second impressions. Baths at Jalapa. Vera Cruz. Some account of San Juan de Ulua. Siege of 1825. Siege of 1838. General Bustamante. Theatre. Of the North Winds. Vera Cruz, 6th January, 1842. Having concluded our arrangements for leaving Mexico on the 2nd of January, we determined, as the diligence started long before daybreak, not to attempt taking any rest that night. We went out early, and took leave of the Dowager Marquesa de Vivanco, who was confined to the house by illness, and whose kindness to us has been unremitting ever since our arrival. It is a sad thing to take leave of a person of her age, and in her delicate state of health, whom there is scarcely a possibility of our ever seeing again. Some days before, we parted also from one of our oldest friends here, the Countess C a. The last day, besides the Spaniards, who have been our constant friends and visitors ever since we came here, we had melancholy visits of adieu from Señor Gomez Padraza and his lady, from the families of Echavarri, of Fagoaga, Cortina, Escandon, Casaflores, and many whose names are unknown to you. Amongst others was the Güera Rodriguez. About 8 o'clock, accompanied even to the door of the carriage by a number of ladies who were with us to the last, and amongst these were P a, C a, and L z e n, we broke short all these sad partings, and with the A s and the family of the French Minister, set off for the theatre of New Mexico. I can imagine your surprise at such a finale, but it was the only means left us of finishing a painful scene, and of beguiling the weary hours yet remaining before the diligence started, for it was in vain to think of rest or sleep that night. The theatre was very crowded, the play an amusing piece of diablerie, called the Pata de Cabra, the goat's foot, badly got up, of course, as its effect depends upon scenery and machinery. I believe it was very entertaining, but I cannot say we felt inclined to enter into the spirit of it. The family of General V a were there, and this being the day of a great diplomatic dinner given by Santa Anna, various officers and diplomates came in late and in full dress. I was informed by one of the company that 6 colonels stood the whole time of dinner behind his Excellency's chair. I wonder what French officer would do as much for Louis Philippe, vogue le Galère. From the theatres, which concluded about 1, we drove to the house of the Minister, where we spent a very grave half hour, and then returned home with a very splendid brioche of generous proportions, which Madame la Baronne de had kindly prepared for our journey. Arrived at the A s's, we sat down to supper, and never was there a sadder meal than this, when for the last time we sat at the hospitable board of these our earliest and latest Mexican friends. We were thankful when it was all over, and we had taken leave, and when, accompanied to the inn by Señor A d and other gentlemen, we found ourselves fairly lodged in the diligence, on a dark and rather cold morning, sad, sleepy, and shivering. All Mexico was asleep when we drove out of the gates. The very houses seemed sunk in slumber. So terminated our last Mexican New Year's Day. When we reached the eminence from which is the last view of the valley, the first dawn of day was just breaking over the distant city. The white summits of the volcanoes were still enveloped in mist, and the lake was veiled by low clouds of vapour that rose slowly from its surface. And this was our last glimpse of Mexico. The diligence is now on a new and most fatiguing plan of travelling night and day after leaving Puebla, so that, starting from Mexico at 4 o'clock in the morning of the 2nd of January, it arrives in Vera Cruz early on the morning of the 5th, saving a few hours and nearly killing the travellers. The government had granted us escorts for the whole journey, now more than ever necessary. It was 5 in the afternoon when we reached Puebla, and we set off again by dawn the next morning. We had just left the gates, and our escort, which had rode forward, was concealed by some rising ground, when by the faint light we perceived some half dozen mounted cavaliers making stealthily up to us across the fields. Their approach was first discerned by a Spanish lady who was with us, and who was travelling with strings of pearl and valuable diamonds concealed about her person, which made her peculiarly sharp-sighted on the occasion. "Ladrones!" said she, and every one repeated "Ladrones!" in different intonations. They rode across the fields, came up pretty close to the diligence, and reconnoitred us. I was too sleepy to be frightened, and reconnoitred them in return with only one eye open. The coachman whipped up his horses, the escort came in sight, and the gentlemen struck into the fields again. The whole passed in a minute or so. The soldiers of the escort came riding back to the diligence, and the captain, galloping up to the window, gave himself great credit for having frightened away the robbers. We arrived at Perote when it was nearly dusk, supped, and started again at 11 o'clock at night. We passed a horrible night in the diligence, and were thankful when daybreak showed us the beautiful environs of Jalapa. It is singular that on a second impression returning by this road, the houses appear handsomer than they did before, and nature less beautiful. I conclude that this is to be accounted for simply from the circumstance of the eye having become accustomed both to the works of nature and of man, which characterizes this country. The houses, which at first appeared gloomy, large, and comfortless, habit has reconciled us to, and experience has taught us that they are precisely suited to this climate of perpetual spring. The landscape, with its eternal flowers and verdure, no longer astonishes and bewilders us, as when we first arrived from a country where, at that season, all nature lies buried in snow. Besides, in our last journey through Michoacán, we have passed through scenes even more striking and beautiful than these. Then the dresses, which at first appeared so romantic, the high Moorish looking saddle, the gold embroidered manga, the large hat shading the swarthy faces of the men, the coloured petticoat and reboso and long black hair of the women, though still picturesque, have no longer the charm of novelty, and do not attract our attention. The winter also has been unusually severe for Mexico, and some slight frosts have caused the flowers of this natural garden to fade; and besides all this, we were tired and sleepy and jolted, and knew that we had but an hour or two to remain, and had another day and night of purgatory in prospect. Still, as we passed along the shady lanes, amongst the dark chirimoyas, the green-leaved bananas, and all the variety of beautiful trees entwined with their graceful creepers, we were forced to confess that winter has little power over these fertile regions, and that in spite of the leveller habit, such a landscape can never be passed through with indifference. Arrived at Jalapa, we refreshed ourselves with the luxury of a bath, having to pass through half the city before we reached the bathing establishment, from which there is the most beautiful view of wood, water, and mountain that it is possible to behold. The baths are the property of a lady who has a cotton factory and a good house in the city, and fortunate she is in possessing a sufficient portion of worldly goods, since, as she informed us, she is the mother of 20 children. She herself in appearance was little more than 30. We then returned to breakfast, and shortly after left Jalapa. I will not inflict upon you a second description of the same journey, of Plan del Rio with its clear river and little inn, of Puerta del Rey with a solid majestic bridge thrown over the deep ravine, through which rushes the impetuous river Antigua, or of how we were jolted over the road leading to Paso de Oveja, etc. Suffice it to say that we passed a night which, between suffocating heat, horrible jolting, and extreme fatigue, was nearly intolerable. Stopping to change horses at Santa Fe, we saw by the light of the torches which they brought to the door that we were once more among bamboo huts and palm trees. Towards morning we heard the welcome sound of the waves, giving us joyful token that our journey was drawing to a close. Yet when we entered Vera Cruz and got out of the diligence, we felt like prisoners who have been so long confined in a dungeon they are incapable of enjoying their liberty, we were so thoroughly worn out and exhausted.